Well, for those of you who may have heard about my speech yesterday, I'm just glad that the podium is about 3 feet lower because I had Cadet Radish introduce me, and he's about 12 feet tall. So you can imagine the differences between our heights. I could barely see the audience. So after that kind of introduction, I even like myself, like I sound cool. Hopefully it's a little more than the 10% truth that we typically have. But in all seriousness, I do hope that what I have to share with you today, as you continue through your time here, through your commissioning sources and here at the Academy, and as you take your oath and embark on your service, that some of the things that I have to say will continue to resonate with you and help guide you and be of use to you as airmen. In the decade following 9/11, I really didn't talk about my experience because I didn't feel like I had a story to tell. After all, on that day, I was just the wingman. I landed, ran to the bathroom, called my mom and dad, and then went on to fly a second sortie that day. I went home that night, and the next day, went back to the squadron, flew again, and continued on doing the same thing that all of my fellow squadron mates were doing, and going through the same emotions that the rest of the country was going through. So I'm sure you've heard people say that they remember exactly where they were and what they were doing when they learned of Pearl Harbor, or of the Kennedy assassination, Challenger perhaps, in 9/11. Because those are really important turning points in our history. They mark the end of one era and the beginning of another one. So we all have stories of 9/11. Well, maybe some of you don't. You might have been like 4 years old. You may not have remembered it. But I clearly, I do, and many other old people do too, right? But 9/11 is a really critical turning point for our nation. It's another day, like Pearl Harbor, that will live in infamy. So from my perspective, everyone has a story from that day, and mine didn't seem really all that special. And certainly after all the 24/7 media coverage that occurred on that day, to talk about what happened to me would have seemed self-serving. 9/11 was not about me. I did not want, and I had no thought of exploiting or commodifying our collective national experience. After all, hadn't we been through enough trauma already? It just seemed to me to talk about that would be self-serving, especially when I consider our brothers and sisters in New York who lost loved ones, or the Pentagon. I cannot begin to approach, even imagine what they have been through. So I hold their experiences sacred. But at the 10-year commemoration, my flight lead that day, Mark Sasseville, asked me to participate with him in a National Geographic special produced by Allison Argo. So I did it for SAS. And I hadn't really given that much thought to that Tuesday morning. As I mentioned, I was and I continue to be disgusted by the fear-mongering that our national media stokes. But in the process of telling the story to Allison and her crew, they were so moved that I somehow began to feel obligated to consent when others began to ask for the story of that brilliant blue morning. And in the retelling, I began to realize that it isn't actually my story, it's our story. Let me take a moment and encourage you to take ownership of this heritage. Never let the Army or the Navy say that we don't have a history as airmen, that our service somehow lacks depth or richness, because as airmen, our history, the history of our service, has been the ultimate adventure tale of vision, of risk, and some of our campaigns have been the most exciting, the most momentous, and significant in the last century, actions upon which, in a very literal way, the globe turned. For example, if you take a look at the very beginning, the Lafayette Escadrille, patriotic airmen, they were the first seeds of our combat air forces. They answered the call to oppose fascism before our nation even did. Billy Mitchell, who witnessed the slaughter of ground warfare in World War I and was convinced that air power promised a better way than a strategy of bloody attrition. Over, not through. The Ostfriesland, not just a successful demonstration of aerial attack, but a morally courageous advocacy of our burgeoning might. Our successful sinking of the Ostfriesland woke the Navy up, and in many ways is the real genesis of the Naval Aircraft Carrier Force, in recognition of the threat that air power now posed. So if you fast forward a little bit, you think about World War II and Midway, our first major victory in the Pacific. It was also the first major naval battle waged entirely through aircraft. So ships from the opposing forces never actually came in contact, demonstrating conclusively that naval power without air power is obsolete. And so with the Ostfriesland, an insolent air corps sunsets the dominance of the battleship and shapes the force structure of the Navy to this day. You think about the 1924 Douglas World Cruisers, open cockpit biplanes that circumnavigate the globe with nothing more than a magnetic whiskey compass, an altimeter, and airspeed indicators. So these guys had real grit and world-class logistics and advance teams. Pan American Goodwill flights, the question mark, an aerial refueling experiment that sets the idea and the notion of global reach. The development of precision strategic bombing, not as a tactic or a technology, but a fundamentally different way of waging war that sought to restrict our enemies' choices by paralyzing their centers of gravity. How Robin Olds' father, pilots a B-17, guided by a young fighter pilot and brilliant navigator, Curtis LeMay. They fly through a squall of thunderstorms to lead a flight of B-17s to intercept the Italian ocean liner, the SS Rex, infuriating the Navy, but proving the long-range strategic utility of air power. And these are just a few of the stories that you need to know. It's not some dusty history that you can just close a book on. This is part of your heritage, it's part of who you are, it's part of your identity. So if you don't mind, I would like to share another story with you. We'd just gotten back from Red Flag that previous Saturday, and we're getting ready to clean the jets off because at Red Flag we'd been doing opposed surface air attacks, so we had ECM pods and external fuel tanks and TERS and racks. And so we're moving those off because we're going to get back to BFM, basic fighter maneuvers. We're going to go out and get into a dogfighting phase. We're going to clean that off. But you know, we'd just gotten back from 2 weeks in Iraq, so it was really an empty squadron. Most guys were on leave, or they'd gone back to their real jobs as traditionals. So all we had that morning to send out was a 3-ship to go down to the Air Force Dare County ranges. They're going to go do some basic surface attacks. So bombing with dumb bombs and a little bit of strafing, while the rest of the crews clean off the other airplanes, and then we'll clean off those jets when they get back home. Lou Shooter Campbell, Eric Puck Hagenson, and Billy Hutchison go down to Cape Hatteras to bomb for quarters and do some low-angle strafe, because who doesn't like a little strafe? In the meantime, the rest of us were sitting in a long-range scheduling meeting, figuring out what sorties were going to go that day, who was up for a check ride, who's in an upgrade, what flights they're going to need. And a knock comes at the door, and one of our enlisted troops, Dave Chunks Callahan, sort of looks through and says, "An airplane flew into the World Trade Center." Well, we didn't have a television. We look outside, and it was totally blue, and we're thinking, wow, how does someone like pooch their instrument approach that badly? We're thinking maybe it was a little Cessna scud running down the Hudson and just made a bad turn, but I mean, normally the weather pattern in DC is very similar to the weather pattern in New York. Once you get airborne, it's not that far away. So we're thinking, well, maybe it was just some low fog and he was scud running. We made a couple jokes and we got back to the business at hand. So it wasn't until Chunks came back the second time and said, a second aircraft flew into the World Trade Center, and it was on purpose, that we realized this was different. We got up, we went to the bar, and we saw the television, the footage that everyone else has seen, and the iconic images that everyone has seen since. And we were stunned. It's commonly known that in emergencies you experience a time distortion, that time stretches out, and what seems to take forever is really only a few seconds. And it did. It seemed to take forever as we tried to process what we had just witnessed. Because it didn't seem real. It couldn't be real. But we knew it was. In emergencies, you have to suspend that desire, that motion for disbelief, and accept the data that's presented to you and act on that data. Because when you stay suspended in that disbelief, it prevents you from handling the situation at hand. So we know we have to get airborne. We have to protect the Capitol. Brandon, Igor, Rasmussen, and I go to the mission planning room to load our data transfer cartridges. They're like these big bricks, these DTCs, they're like thumb drives that you program all the information that you need for your mission set. So what you're loading up under the wings, what your navigation route is, where your threats are, what your data links are, we're loading all that in. But how do you mission plan for something like this? Normally, in our scenarios, there's a bad guy land. We have routes. There's a forward line of troops and a forward edge of the battle area. There are threat targets and sites, but this is home. And the closest analogy we have is defensive counter-air, but even that's not really good. We might be protecting the BX, but where's the origin point of the threat? It could be from anywhere. It came from behind. What axis do we plan on? So we're loading our DTCs and our maps with all the local airports in case there are other threats coming up from smaller airports, with the landmarks, memorials, the big government buildings. And we place Bullseye, our main reference point, as Reagan National Airport. But we have no weapons, nothing to load up for fusing. We have no route of flight. We calculate our takeoff and landing data, are told. We print our maps and our lineup cards, and Igor and I go to hawk the ops counter. Our wing commander, Brigadier General David Worley, had come down to ops from the wing building, and he's behind the counter. He's on the phone, and he's trying to get us authority to launch. Now I'm going to talk for a minute about the creepy subject of organization, because organizational structure matters. You have to ensure that the right information flows to the right decision makers, and that those decision makers have the appropriate span and depth of control, and the responsibility and authority and legal mechanisms are aligned so that the mission can be executed. We had none of that. The 121st Fighter Squadron and the 113th Wing is an Air National Guard unit. Now, the National Guard has two chains of command, right? You've got your federal and you've got your civilian. For the most part, it runs up through the squadron commander and the ops group commander and the wing commander, but that's really kind of where it breaks down between the two chains. The civilian chain of command, which is the standard daily operations, goes up to the state governor. So the governor can mobilize his National Guard troops for floods and forest fires and other types of emergencies. We see that routinely. Today we call it Defense Support for Civil Authority. The federal chain of command is when typically units get mobilized to go overseas or go do an AEF. And that's when they get chopped to the active duty Air Force, and for all intents and purposes, they become the active duty. But as the District of Columbia Air National Guard, we had no governor. Certainly our commander-in-chief on our civilian side is not going to be the mayor of DC. It actually goes through the Secretary of the Army and winds its way up to the president. Well, as you can imagine on that day, they were all pretty busy, and they weren't answering their phones. So General Worley is calling, but no one is answering. He's still trying to work the chain to get authority to launch. We don't belong to NORAD, to the 1st Air Force, or anyone that owns the alert mission. We didn't belong to them. They couldn't call down and scramble us. Even if they knew that we were there at Andrews Air Force Base, who knows if they could have found our phone number They certainly didn't have the appropriate lines of authority, right? Because we didn't belong to any of those organizations that were responsible for protecting our CONUS. See, we had stopped sitting defensive alert when we gave up our thuds for our Phantoms in the early 80s. And although those old alert shelters were still there on base, they were really more of a new guys orientation and its storage than anything else. We knew we needed to launch. It was clear our nation was under attack, and we live in the capital of the free world. We had to assume that we were next, but we could not launch. I've been asked why we didn't. Why did we wait, right? Because in that time, the Pentagon was hit. Could we physically have done it? Sure. Was launching the right and the necessary thing to do? Yes. But there's a reason why we have command and control. Command and control synchronizes our efforts, ensures that we operate within our commander's intent, and that we understand the limits of our power. Imagine the consequences if we had launched without authorization. Our military forces are rightfully under the control of our civilian leadership. If we had launched without the authorization to do so, that would have been insubordination of an unimaginable scale. What if we had found Flight 93? What if we had stumbled upon some other civilian aircraft and taken that down? We had no idea what response was actually being coordinated or going on outside of our smallest squadron. So if we had launched, we could have actually increased the fog of war, and that day was already full of confusion. So making a unilateral decision to launch that day was far too risky, and the potential consequences too large. It was the right decision for us to stay on the ground until we could get the orders to go. While General Worley is on the phone, Mark Sasseville, our director of operations at the time, is also on the phone. He's calling the air traffic control tower. He's calling the tower there in Andrews, trying to get the Secret Service on the line, or to see if the tower controllers can patch us through to the Secret Service. You see, on Andrews Air Force Base, when Air Force One moves, the Secret Service takes control of the field, and they actually manage all of the aircraft operations. Typically, there's an aircraft freeze or ramp freeze, meaning that you can't taxi, you can't take off, you can't land. Nothing moves on the field except those assets which are supporting the president. Now, when you're a little fighter jet that burns gas quickly but doesn't have a whole lot of it, this can be a real problem. I can't tell you the number of times I had to divert because I couldn't land there at Andrews and I had reached bingo fuel. So we had reached out to the Secret Service to establish a relationship with them, to see if there was a way that we could work with them to meet the needs of security for the president, while at the same time facilitating our own training and force management needs, landing airplanes at our home base. So that's our hope, that we can shortcut the chain of command. Not go outside of it, but shortcut the chain of command and go straight to the top. We're counting on our personal relationships to get the appropriate authority. So it goes to show you the importance of relationships sometimes in getting things done. One of the great advantages of what you're doing here today through your commissioning sources here at the Academy is the rich relationships that you're establishing, and I encourage you to keep those strong as you go forward through your careers, because you will find times when the relationships that you have help facilitate your mission accomplishment. And as this is going on, Dan Raisin Kane is on the phone with a bomb dump. Now, Raisin is our weapons officer, which means he's our top instructor pilot. He's our tactical thought leadership. Raisin's on the phone with the guys in the bomb dump, which is where we store all of our weapons. Now, the bomb dump is like way off behind the golf course, right? Because you don't want to keep your collection of things that go boom next to all your buildings or all your fuel, right? And also, the bomb dump, we don't keep our bombs and our missiles fully built up. Fuses, explosives, the bodies, the missile bodies, the bomb bodies, those are all kept separately. So it takes the bomb dump time to actually build up weapons, which is part of the reason why their tasking order, when it comes down, is 3 days prior to when those bombs and those missiles actually have to hit the flight line. It's part of the battle rhythm. Now, those guys, they've got bombs, they've got fuses, so they don't have a whole lot of electronics back there. And remember, this is 2001, right? They might have a television, but they have landlines. And who knows, when Raisin calls them up, maybe he's disrupting their card game. But they have no idea what's going on. They're living in a pre-9/11 world. So Raisin calls them up and he's telling them, I need you guys to build me some AIM-9s. No, not CATMs, not training. Live ones. I need real explosives. No, just trust me. Get those missiles to the flight line as soon as you can. Now, can you imagine being that enlisted troop in the bomb dump? You have no idea what's going on. There's no frag, there's no ATO, and all of a sudden the weapons officer calls up and says, I need real weapons? I mean, it's not like we were in an AEF. We were at home. We were in good guy land, right? So it really is a testament to the leadership and the relationship that Raisin had built with these troops, right? They knew Raisin because he had spent time with them. He learned what they did, and he valued their job, and he valued them. And he had spent time with them explaining to them how the process works, how the orders come down. He had been transparent. So they knew him, and they trusted his motives, his knowledge, and his judgment. And now he's asking them to do something that makes absolutely no sense. So it is definitely a testament to the credibility and the leadership and the relationship that Raisin had established with them, and the discipline of those troops that they began right away to build those 9 mics. Now, ordering weapons is a totally different risk category than launching without authorization, right? We can build those missiles up, we can take them to the flight line, and they load those missiles up and they're driving as fast as they can. The governor on those little tracks is like 5 miles an hour. But we can load them up on the aircraft, and we can manage those potential consequences. But we could not have managed the consequences of actually launching. So I think that you can see the difference in terms of leaning forward and where we were willing to take those risks and where we weren't. The magnitude is totally different. Again, while all this is going on, Phil Dog Thompson, who was our supervisor of flying that day, he was our SOF, and I love Dog. He was this crusty old Phantom driver. He'd gone through weapons school in the F4, and he had this big, fluffy Vietnam mustache, and he was just good. He was just full of good old common sense. Dog's on the phone, and he's calling down to the Dare County Ranger, and he's telling the Dare County Ranger, get the bullies home. Tell them to buster. Have them come home as fast as they can. Now, remember there was a 3-ship down there. Puck Higginson was number 2. He, in the meantime, had run out of fuel. He'd gone bingo fuel, and so he got sent home early. So he's already on his way home when Dog's calling down to the Dare County Ranger. Dog puts down the phone, and he gets the call over the frequency, over the SOF frequency. Guard SOF is Bully 2. Bully 2, Guard SOF, go. Guard SOF, Washington isn't going to let me enter the airspace. They're not going to let me come back home. Bully 2, you just keep on coming home. I'll deal with Washington. Click. Calls up ATC. Bully 2 gets Puck cleared into the airspace. And shortly thereafter, Puck calls back, Guard SOF, Bully 2. Bully 2, Guard SOF, go. Washington Center is asking me if I've got any missiles or bombs on board. Bully 2, don't you worry about that. You just come on home and land. It wasn't until weeks later that I had the opportunity to listen to Puck's tapes. And it still gives me chills. He's getting close to the field, so he calls up ATIS, the Aerodrome Terminal Information System. It's an audio loop that just goes over and over, and it's identified by letter, and it tells the pilot the most recent information there on the field, what the landing runway is, the barometric pressure, what the winds are doing with the ceiling, pertinent things that a pilot needs to know when they come into land. This is what the ATIS said. This is Andrews Air Force Base Information Bravo. Andrews Air Force Base is closed. Washington Class Bravo airspace is closed. Any aircraft attempting to enter Washington Class Bravo airspace will be shot down. So I don't know when the Pentagon was hit in this timeline, but it was Vice President Cheney who called the Secret Service. Aren't there fighters at Andrews? For heaven's sakes, get somebody airborne. And the Secret Service knew how to find us. They had our phone number. Lucky, you're with me. Raisin, you and Igor wait till you get some 9 mics on board. Come on, Lucky, let's go. Sass and I run down to life support, throwing our gear on, and I'm mentally double checking. Okay, I got my helmet bag, my checklist, my DTC, got my lineup card, don't forget my harness, and I'm zipping up my G-suit when Sass looks at me and says, I'll take the cockpit. I would take the tail. I had known from some terrible 737 accidents, which actually occurred out here on the Front Range, that when you lose the tail, when you lose the balancing forces of the horizontal stabilizer, that the aircraft just tips right over and goes straight down into the ground. So if we took out the cockpit, the aircraft would eventually glide to the ground, but would have a fan of debris. And so in order to ensure the redundancy of targeting, Sass would take the front, and I would take the tail. And hopefully by hitting the tail, we would minimize the debris because it would become nothing but a vaporized smoking hole, very literally. So we could avoid the additional collateral damage and the additional casualties. So I've had people ask me, who told you that you would ram the airplane? That that's what you would have to do? Well, no one did. Anyone who had seen the images of the Trade Center, who had seen what had happened and what had happened at the Pentagon, knew what needed to be done. And what was said was all that was said. 105 rounds of training projectiles, lead-nosed bullets, was not going to be sufficient. Between the two of us, we had 210, so it was 2.1 seconds of gun. That wasn't going to be enough to take down an airliner. So we're running down the sidewalk from the ops building down to the flight line, and it goes down this little creek, and the trees are dappling the grass with the shadows of the sun. It was just absolutely a brilliant morning, and Sass runs to the first jet on the flight line, and I take the one that's right next to him. Now, remember, I'm still pretty green. My priorities as lieutenant are simple and clear. Stay visual, fly good formation, and make sure there's popcorn, beer, and coffee in the bar, right? That's what I care about. So I wanted to do things right. And as every pilot knows, when you start messing up your habit patterns is when problems start to happen. You start making mistakes. So I run up to the jet, and I shake my crew chief's flight line, and I grab the 781 forms from him. I start looking through those, and Sass looks at me and goes, Lucky, what the hell are you doing? Get in the goddamn jet. That's when I realized this is really different. Throw the checklist out. There wasn't going to be any walk around, none of the normal start procedures. So I had to rely on not my training, not my habit patterns, but my knowledge of the aircraft systems so that I could improvise something that I had never been trained for. I had to make up my own procedures for scrambling. We didn't have GPS in the Block 30 back then, but we did have these ring laser gyros, and they were really high speed. Instead of having to wait 16 minutes to spin up, it only took us 8 minutes to spin up and get a navigation platform. Once we got the coordinates for the inertial navigation system in. And the process for starting the F-16, the crew chief plugs his comm cord in, and he's talking to you, and you're talking to him. And it's a challenge and response. It's like a ballet, it's like a dance. As you say something and he says something as you go through it. And it typically takes 15, 20 minutes to spin up the aircraft. But we didn't have 10 minutes. We didn't have 8. Master battery on, JAFA start 2, 20% going idle. Watch the temperature on the RPM. 40% less than 750, all right. Aircraft stabilized at idle, sec check, EPU check. Flick is bit to step 43. And I'm screaming, pull the chocks, pull the chocks. All the while hoping that my in-flight alignment for my INS is gonna work. And my crew chief is still plugged in. He's still talking to me as I'm taxiing after SAS. And I look down, and there's crew chiefs in my gear, pulling my gear pins, pulling the pins out of my TERS, pulling the pins out of my chafe boxes as I taxi to follow SAS to runway 1 right. In the meantime, Shooter and Billy had gotten back and they landed. And Dog, our SOF, he's on the radio and he's asking them how much gas they have. Shooter, not enough. Billy, he's got maybe 1,200 pounds. All right, Billy, you got just enough gas for one pass up and down the river. One pass. They think another one's coming down, and they think it's low, and they think it's on the river. So on my tapes, Billy's taking off, and SAS and I take off seconds behind him. Billy takes off, he goes north, he goes over the Pentagon, he goes up the Potomac to Great Falls, he turns back around, goes back down the Potomac to the south, just to where it's going to hook to the left, go east of the Chesapeake Bay, and then he comes back and he lands. SAS and I take off right after him, and we head out northwest, and we never found anything. We were not heroes that day. The passengers on Flight 93 are the true heroes. SAS and I took off and headed northwest in an eerily quiet sky. We checked in with Potomac Departure, and we worked with them as we vectored into Pennsylvania, burning worms with our radars low to fill in any of the gaps that Potomac couldn't see. We flew far enough to sanitize the airspace to build enough time for us to respond when we returned to the Combat Air Patrol. And once we got far enough out to build in that time, because remember, we didn't have any defense in depth, we needed to turn back to ensure that because we were on a single axis, granted we were a 2-ship, but we were still that single axis, we had to make sure that we weren't going to get flanked and leave the capital unprotected. So SAS calls Ranch House. We head back to DC, and he has us set up a counter-rotating cap so that we would always have somebody looking and never have our backs turned. SAS begins to teach Potomac TRACON how to talk AWACS, right? Think about it, the FAA's air traffic controllers, they're trained to sequence airplanes along known routes, and their job is to ensure that as they sync with those aircraft, they keep the operations flowing smoothly and that aircraft are separated. But now we're asking them to facilitate interceptions. We're asking them to not separate us, but to bring us together. And to do that with aircraft that are not on known routes, but are random and unpredictable. So SAS is telling them, all right, so you see the VORTAC there on Reagan, right? The DCA VORTAC? All right, I know it's a DCA VORTAC, just call it Bullseye. You have radials on that, and you've got DME. So what we want you to do is call out the radial, the DME, and then give us an altitude, and that'll help us with our contacts and your contacts. So for example, if there's an airplane that's to the east and it's 15 miles and it's 3,000 feet, call it Bullseye 090 for 15, 3,000. And it was phenomenal, the mental agility of those controllers, how quickly they adapted. And as the day wore on, and the airspace came congested with first responders and other military aircraft, Potomac Departure not only continued to call out those Bullseye contacts, but then they would tack on transponders, call signs, and destinations. So in many ways, they are really some unsung heroes with their mental agility. I tell you this part of the story because it's important to understand that none of us can do our job without all of us. Yes, SAS and I were the tip of the spear that day, and we were the ones that faced the very real possibility of sacrificing our lives. But we could not have done any of what we did were it not for everyone working together. So what you do may be unsung, like the weapons troops, the bomb dump, or Potomac TRACON, but never doubt the essential nature of your duties and how important you are to the overall accomplishment of the mission. From the time that SAS and I took off, we, the DC Guard, were the CAP commanders. Later that day, during my second sortie, we received free fire orders, meaning that we as individual fighter pilots can make the autonomous and independent decision to call an entity hostile and shoot it down. We didn't have complex rules of engagement, and we didn't have to ask Mother May I from the KAOC. We didn't have to ask permission. So it's really a testament to the professionalism and the discipline of our airmen that day, and how they worked with and coordinated with all the other assets that were available to us, that despite the confusion and trauma, no one got trigger happy. We worked proactively with Potomac Approach and later on the AWACS that showed up to positively identify and clear all the entities, have them land, and safely protect the airspace while we facilitated the first responders, the medevacs, and all the military movements that were going on that day. And we owned the DC cap for over the next 2 weeks. And we worked with the Pentagon to begin to normalize those operations of command and control and hand that cap over to the 1st Air Force. And also try to untangle what had happened. Where had we failed? A week or so after 9/11, our ops group commander, Jeff Tuna Johnson, was in the Pentagon. Tuna was spending quite a bit of time in the Pentagon then. People don't really remember, but the Pentagon burned for weeks afterwards. So Tuna is walking down one of the hallways, and the Pentagon is still burning. So his sinuses are sting, and his eyes are kind of watering. And he was in his flight suit, and he's walking down one of these hallways, and a fellow stops him, because he can read the patches, right? He says, "You from the DC Guard?" And Tuna says, "Yeah." And this is the story that he told Tuna and the story that Tuna told us. When the Pentagon was hit, they began to evacuate everyone. People went into south parking, they went out the metro entrance, they went out the north entrance, north parking. Now, if you're not familiar with where north parking is at the Pentagon, it's located in between a busy highway and the river, and you have to cross the highway over a bridge to get to north parking. The wind was coming out of the southwest that morning. It was light. It was a beautiful day to fly. So the smoke is gently moving over the Pentagon and actually moving into north parking. And there's a child development center there at the Pentagon, and it's nestled there at the bottom of the bridge on the Pentagon side. And people are evacuating, and the women are evacuating the CDC, and they're coming out with buggies of 6 kids and cribs of three babies. They're evacuating, but their procedures are for fire drills. But they've got to get to the other side. So as they're coming out, they realize they can't take their children over the bridge because they can't roll those buggies up the stairs. So these women are giving babies away. "I can't carry them all, can you please?" They're giving babies away to the folks that are evacuating out of the Pentagon. And the people. Normally in a crowd, it's about 120 decibels. It's almost like the roar of a jet as people are talking and chatting back and forth. But the crowd in North Parking is totally silent. The smoke is drifting over them, and the ashes are kind of coming down. And the mixed, noxious scent of just everything burning. And remember, this was really before cell phones were ubiquitous, right? I mean, like if you were really somebody, you might have a BlackBerry. If you were important, you would have a pager. But we didn't have just cell phones everywhere. We didn't have these little computers in our pockets. But you had just come out of the Pentagon. So you knew what had happened, and you knew that there were more coming. But you still didn't know. There was the uncertainty of the unknown. So they're totally silent. And Billy suddenly comes roaring over the Pentagon at like 200 feet in full afterburner. The crowd erupts into cheers because they knew they were safe. American fighter jets were airborne. We were overhead. We would protect them. We would keep them safe. And everything was going to be okay. As airmen, as the Air Force, we are America's archangels. More than any other service, our nation relies upon the Air Force for our collective security. Global vigilance, global reach, global power. This is not just some slogan. Whether it's our national assets and satellite constellations, the persistent ISR of our global Hawks, the U-2s, even think back to the SR-71. It is the Air Force that watches the world and provides critical intelligence for our national leadership. And now with Cyber Command, we've taken that monitoring to an entirely different level, to a totally different domain, and one that is increasingly essential to our way of life. And global reach isn't just about FedEx, mobility and logistics. Global reach is really about how the Air Force enables us to touch any part of the globe and to bring our nation's power to bear anywhere across the globe. The Navy likes to claim that they're a global power, but they steam around the ocean at about 35 knots, and the closest they can get to is port. Our force extenders, our tankers, enable our B-2s to fly 24-hour-plus missions halfway around the world and back. We can deploy a package of F-22s and all their spares and support in short notice anywhere around the world. And our strategic mobility rapidly deploys Army troops and their supplies, and we can deliver humanitarian goods in time and in quantity to relieve suffering from natural disasters. And our ICBMs stolidly maintain nuclear deterrence, which, by the way, if you think about it, our ICBMers, they are the ultimate in the undefeated teams. They are 0 for 0. Think about it. Good job. As airmen, though, we think differently. The physical attributes of our domains of airspace and cyber mean that we think about strategic and operational and tactical problem sets. We're thinking in 4 dimensions. We're thinking in parallel operations. We are exo-atmospheric, we are supersonic, we are hypersonic. We are the speed of light. We think about generating effects. We're focused on outcomes, not inputs. Our way of operations is not the linear progression of branches and sequels that are limited by the 2 dimensions of a map. We don't think force on force. Air power is not a blunt instrument of attrition. In the weeks and the months that followed that Tuesday morning, people asked, how could this happen? Where was our air defense? What happened to alert? Well, after the wall fell and the Soviet Union dissolved, we dramatically reduced our military investments, recapitalization, and force structure. The perception of any threat to our territory dissolved in the rush to reach this peace dividend. And our alert forces were reduced to 4 squadrons at the corners of the CONUS on a lonely alert. Remember, we were postured for Soviet bombers coming over the poles to drop nukes on us. We were looking out, we weren't looking in. We never bothered to imagine that outlier, that black swan, something that might shatter our paradigms. So what we suffered on 9/11 was a failure of imagination. But let us not again be victims of that failure. That is the belief that the future will be like the present. For over 15 years, we've been engaged in these counterinsurgencies and low-intensity conflicts in Afghanistan, Iraq, and the broader Middle East, environments which, although they've had their own challenges, have been quite permissive to our operations. The 1985 Block 30 F-16 that I flew on 9/11, Tail 474. Actually, so think about this for a minute. The F-16, its design roots date back to Nixon. The F-16 design roots date back to Nixon. And the jet was fielded during the Ford and the Carter administrations. I was 11 years old when my jet was born. Now, I know how to look it, but I'm no spring chicken. And so, by the way, 474 is still in active service. She belongs now to Carswell out of Fort Worth. So she's still flying. And she was almost untouchable in the opening salvos of Iraq in 2003 when I was scud hunting in the western deserts of Iraq and supporting special ops troops. Yeah, it wasn't the folded gap of World War III with hordes of Soviet tanks coming over the German countryside, but Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, and Syria what we're fighting now is probably not what 2020 and certainly not what 2030 is going to look like either. When then Secretary Robert Gates terminated the F-22 production in 2010, he criticized the Air Force for having next war-itis. And while I must perhaps agree with his characterization, I don't see anything wrong with thinking about the future. I believe it's imperative, because if we're going to learn anything from our history, it's that we must not become so overly focused on the wars that we're in that we lose the imagination of, and thus the ability to prepare for and avert those wars that might be. That's the status quo that I charge you today to be careful about. Don't let your imagination be limited by what you've experienced. You have never known an America that hasn't been embroiled in counterinsurgency operations or fighting ISIS. You've grown up being told that terrorism is the greatest threat to our nation, and that the Russia that you've known, although aspirational, is discounted as a military eunuch. And China, it really isn't a threat, because you know what? Everything in Walmart comes from China. So war today likely means what our combat operations look like today. Small scale, counterinsurgency, predators, hellfires, IEDs, winning hearts and minds, the small trickle of tragic deaths, permissive airspace, an all-volunteer force of less than 1%, 3 cups of tea, wounded warriors, limitations by collateral damage estimates, and urban warfare in ambiguous environments and the human domain. Over 80% of our officer corps has been commissioned post 9/11. Their most formative experiences have been in counterinsurgency operations. And I don't say these things to belittle these challenges. They are very real, and we must put our best effort towards them. And it really, truly is satisfying. One of the most personally gratifying things that I have done was buddy lasing bombs in when soft troops were under fire at Haditha Dam. And I could hear the mortars exploding over the radio as the guys are calling for my bombs, volunteering their initials for danger close. And I can see the point of origin through my MVGs, and I can slew my laser marker down to that point of origin and buddy lays a bomb as my flight lead releases, and buy them some quiet, buy them some space, buy them some breathing room and some survivability. But when a B-1 pilot tells me that close air support is his most important mission, I have to worry that we become trapped in this war-itis, that we've lost our history, lost our ability to imagine, and that we're losing our fundamental understanding of what air power is and what we provide uniquely for our nation. Air power isn't about airplanes for the sake of white scarves and volleyball and cool sunglasses and chicks dig it. Air power is an essential precondition of any military action. The other services and our nation rely upon us to provide domain dominance, provide responsive and persistent intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, provide the communications, command, and control, to move anything, anywhere on the globe, and not just hold any target around the world at risk, but to strike and provide effects when called upon. None of the other services, none of them can do their job without us. If you don't have an Air Force, you can't have a joint force. And more than that, air power provides unique and different policy options for our national leadership. We do things that no other service, even with their airplanes, can do. We are the only service that can fulfill our service-specific job without the assistance of the others. Global vigilance, global reach, global power. I was amazed and humbled at the outpouring response that followed that 10th commemoration, and genuinely surprised at how many expressed an amazement of what we were willing to do that day and what the passengers on Flight 93 actually did. Because I believe, and I truly do to my core, that what we were willing to do is not special. any one of us would have done the same thing. Anyone. And why? Because there are things in this world that are more important than ourselves. There are things in this world that are more important than our soft pink bodies. Freedom, the Constitution of the United States of America, our way of life, mom, apple pie, baseball, those things that make us uniquely American, these are more important than us. They endure beyond us. We all belong to something that is greater than ourselves. In the time since that clear blue morning, I've come to realize that courage is not unique or special or possessed by only a chosen few. Courage exists inside each and every one of us. In the normal, perfectly average people that helped each other in the moments before the towers fell, the firefighters, the EMTs that didn't run away, but they ran into the dust and the rubble of those collapsing buildings. Neighbors and strangers coming together to help each other. And those who sacrificed to undertake the dangerous and difficult task of cleaning up and rebuilding, knowing that what they were doing, that their work was going to slowly kill them, but waking up each day and going to do that. You don't get to choose to be a hero. That's an accident of history and chance. But what we do get to choose, and what we must choose every day, is how we exercise that courage in our choices and our actions every day. Courage must become a habit. Doing the right thing when it's little means that you will do the right thing when it's hard, frightening, and carries real consequences. And this is another reason why you must be voracious students of air power history. This history is perhaps the best and maybe the only antidote to failure of imagination. So let me share another story with you. Think about the 8th Air Force, the airmen of the 8th Air Force in World War II. So Ira Eaker stands up the 8th to prosecute the strategic bombing campaign against Germany. And these are the men that flew the B-17s, the B-24s, P-51s, 47s, 38s. Daylight raids into flak-filled skies over German territory, above Schweinfurt and Regensburg. Eaker had a careful balance, trying to place enough pressure, consistently enough pressure, to degrade the Nazi regime's ability to wage war, but also he had to preserve his forces sufficiently because it took America 3 years to gin up our industry. It took us 3 years to really be able to get him sufficient production to replace his losses. And did you know that more airmen in just the 8th Air Force alone in the European theater, we lost more airmen in the 8th Air Force than the entire Marine Corps around the globe through the entire course of World War II. That's a staggering statistic. So don't tell me that courage is something that only happens when it's hand-to-hand combat. Think about the courage of these men. They had over a 50% probability of dying, and yet each day you summon the courage to go strap into an airplane and go do your mission when perhaps the day before, the buddy next to you lost his arms, lost his legs, maybe he even vaporized or got sucked out the aircraft. These crews were not volunteers either. They were not like you who chose to step up. These guys were drafted. They were everyday Americans. And every day they faced, they endured. It was that daily courage that eventually triumphed over the unthinkable. The events of 9/11 were intended to terrorize us and to break our spirit. So know your history. Have perspective that is bigger than those pundits on television. See, what they seem to forget is that America was forged with hope and courage and fortitude, and that we have sacrificed much greater in endeavors that are far more trying. We are not a fearful people. We are not a weak people, and we will not be broken. We all have the ability to serve. We all have that courage inside of us, inside of normal, perfectly average people. Let us not wait for some major crisis or an accident of history to bring that hero out. We all have the capacity to make a difference and to make this world a better place. And that's why you're here today, sitting where you are. Because you have made a life, you have chosen to make a life of service. You are also here today because you were chosen. You have been recognized and you stand out as our nation's best promise. And I tell you this, not to instill some sense of arrogance or hubris, but to reinforce your sense of responsibility and your sense of duty. You've chosen to be here. You've chosen to be here because you felt that calling of service, to be part of something that is larger and more purposeful than yourself, and to apply your talents and your potential for the betterment of our great nation. I've received a lot of attention for what I was willing to do that day. And people have pointed to me and called me a hero or a patriot. But I was only the visible tip of that spear, having an accidental place in history by the graces of chance. And I am but one of hundreds of thousands who have pledged to give our lives for our nation and to our nation, to defend our country, our Constitution, and our way of life. I am not the first, and I'm not the last, and neither are you. When you take your oath as an airman, you're becoming something greater than yourself alone. So know your history. It will give you more meaning, more depth, and more purpose than you could imagine, to know your place in that long, courageous line. You are not the first, and you will not be the last. I'd like to take a moment and thank General Miller for inviting me to be here to speak to you today, the NCLS. I certainly hope that my story and what I've shared with you will be of use to you as you go forward. God bless you and support you as you take your oath and go forward as airmen and as officers. God bless America. God bless our Air Force. And I wish you blue skies and tailwinds.